that in terms of, and it'll be something we'll be considering later, but as you're here, I just wanted to ask you from a journalistic perspective, is there a code of conduct within newspapers for how journalists interact with the commercial world? Thanks.
There's the NUI guidelines that came in as part of the 2009 Defamation Act, where there is a code of conduct. Yes, there is. And I think there's 6 principles in it. Yeah.
Okay, and it's not related in any way to any legal,
no,
any law.
No.
So, in terms of the relationship between the commercial return from property advertising, say, at a particular period, say 2004 to 2008, where in some publications the property supplements may have been bigger than the news aspect of the thing. Do you think that in any way influenced the editorial policy of newspapers?
Well, you're going to have the editors and the managing directors who will come in and they'll...
I'm just asking your own view because of your expertise,
and I would defer to the editors in that when they come in. I mean, when I was living in Australia, what was very noticeable was the property correspondence in the newspapers were sponsored by particular property companies, and the financial correspondence in different newspapers and television reports were sponsored by particular banks. So there's all sorts of conflicts of interest there. So I don't think there was that to that extent here.
Okay. Would yeah, that's grand. Would there ever have been an occasion, say, just for argument's sake, your own newspaper, the Sunday Business Post, it could be any newspaper, that you would be aware of where a commercial entity cancelled or pulled advertising because of a line of editorial?
I've written for the Irish Times, the Sunday Business Post and the Irish Times. Editorial interference is what you're referring to. I have my own opinions about that recent experience. But again, I would not be privy to those kind of decisions.
What's your view? Because you said you have one.
Speculate now.
I don't want you to name names, but...
I'll take the chair's advice.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Owen Murphy.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Byrne. Just to come back to one of Senator McSharry's questions in relation to the changes to lobbying and donations legislation that have been made in terms of learning from the crisis, excluding for a moment the cultural aspects or the leadership aspects, is it too soon to tell if we've done enough in terms of the law around donations and lobbying?
Yeah, it is really. I mean, we're still waiting on the Standards and Public Office Commission report. I think, again, it is a missed opportunity by the current coalition not to have pushed the guidelines on party finance when they should have had at that time, because it now allows that donations will be that the annual report of political parties is not obliged to be reported for public consumption until, in theory, after the 2016 general election, which does allow and facilitate and enable that perception that something unorthodox is happening. And I think political parties should demonstrate their commitment to transparency, accountability and all those buzzwords by disclosing their accounts.
And do you believe that it is just a perception, that the purpose of bringing that forward, if you were to do that, would be to combat a perception, or is there something else?
Well, publish the accounts and let me see then.
In relation to private donations, or a person donating privately and it not being disclosed, should that continue to be allowed?
The donation limits are very small now, so I mean, going into the future, it is very likely that the vast majority of donations will be undisclosed. That said, and this is just anecdotal because I haven't seen the accounts recently, but most of the political parties get their money from membership fees, €25, €30, depending on the party, from dinners and national draws in particular. But, publish the accounts, let us see. Why not?
Do you think that the limits could be lower, though?
I don't, to be honest, I don't.
Do you think corporate donations should be completely illegal?
They kind of are already, because if you donate over €200 and you're a corporate body, you must.
No, continue. I'm just getting order for you.
You must be part of. You must get permission from your board to do so, and so in theory, it's made it very difficult to get corporate donations now.
Should we have concentration limits on which sectors can donate to political parties?
When I went through all the different donations to the political parties, there definitely was evidence of X, who was a property developer, donating, his wife donating, his child donating. How do you regulate that? So there are ways around legislation, there are ways around everything. And one of the recommendations that I made to the Standards Commission, they were all very detailed, I don't have that submission before me now, was that in theory, ex-property developer or whatever sector he or she is from could donate individual donations to each member of the political party. So, and in that way, the individual is not donating to a political party, but is donating to individuals, and in that way raising the amount of money that he's giving annually to an individual.
And then, thank you, Chair. In terms of the relationship between the party and the individual, I think in your presentation you were talking about this, a movement towards more donations to the individual politician rather than the party. Would you like to comment further on that and what the implications of that might be?
I think what we're seeing, and Ireland is not different to other countries, is that the loyalty to political parties is diminishing, and that loyalty to political individuals is increasing, and that the brand of a political party is not what it once was, and that people prefer to donate to a particular individual. And that may allow then, it's harder to influence a political party, but it's easier to influence an individual. So.
Okay. Question, Deputy.
Thank you. And just then, moving away from that just briefly, earlier you talked about corruption being sexy. And it can be on TV, but here in Ireland, do you think that we have, or do you think our threshold for accepting unethical or improper behaviour in politicians is higher or lower than in other countries, for example, the UK? And I'll just cite the Andrew Mitchell incident, the Plebgate incident. That was a resignation issue. Do you think we have a higher or lower threshold when it comes to those kinds of practices and standards in political life?
I think there is a sense in Ireland of deja vu, or of here we go again, but what would you expect? And a lot of that is due to the absence of consequences. And when I mentioned the Ansbacher incident, where there was 200 Ansbacher accounts identified, and there wasn't a single prosecution for tax evasion in the biggest incident of tax evasion in the history of the state. And there has been no meaningful consequences from the tribunals. And I think when people see an absence of consequence, then that enables this culture of shrugging the shoulder and here we go again, and that's very important.
Is there sanction then, or bringing in
Deputy?
Thank you.
So that's why the very first recommendation I suggested that there would be an audit of the different agencies tasked with oversight. And I know from speaking privately to the different individuals in those agencies, again, people who are very, very committed to their role of oversight, but a frustration that they don't have the resources to do so, a frustration that there isn't information sharing, and I've written in articles before how the response to the drugs epidemic and the murder of journalists and a policeman in the mid-1990s was the establishment of one of the most innovative bodies in the world that most countries seek to replicate, the Criminal Assets Bureau. Yet after the biggest financial crisis in the history of the state, the response wasn't an overhaul, as was the case in the US, as was the case in the UK, an overhaul of how fraud and economic crime is investigated, prosecuted and resourced. And that to me is incredible that that would not have been done, and very, very short-sighted.
Thank you. Deputy Joe Higgins.
Just following on, Dr. Byrne, from that very point, is an explanation perhaps